What if I told you that everything you are going through right now is exactly what made you great? Not the seasons of comfort, not the years when everything aligned and the road ahead was clear and the doors opened before you even raised your hand to knock. What shaped you, what is shaping you right now in this very moment, is the weight you were never completely sure you could carry, the silence you did not know how to interpret, the desert you did not choose but somehow ended up standing in, with the sun above you and the sand beneath you, and no water visible in any direction. This is the story of a man who understood that long before the world had language to describe it, long before anyone wrote it on a wall or printed it on a page or spoke it into a microphone. His name was Shelomo, son of David, and he is about to show you something about God that most people spend their entire lives failing to understand. Israel was at its height. The armies were feared across the ancient world. The borders stretched wide in every direction, carved out by decades of his father's wars, his father's faith, his father's relentless, sometimes broken, always returning devotion to the God of heaven. The gold from David's conquest sat in enormous reserves, waiting to be shaped into something eternal. The tribal confederacy his father had spent a lifetime unifying was finally breathing as one nation, one people, one beating heart beneath one sky. From the outside, the young king had everything: power, legacy, an administration already built, advisors already positioned, resources that most rulers in the ancient world spent entire lifetimes pursuing without ever touching. The throne of Israel was the most prestigious seat of authority the region had known, and it now belonged to him. But Shelomo knew something the crowd celebrating his coronation did not know. He knew what it felt like to stand inside a vast palace and feel profoundly small. He had grown up watching his father David, the warrior, the shepherd, the dancer, the psalmist, the man who sinned catastrophically and still returned to God with tears that could fill rivers, navigate decades of divine partnership. He had watched how that partnership worked, how it was not a formula but a relationship, how it required not performance but presence, how the days when his father was closest to God were not always the triumphant days. They were the desperate days, the pursued days, the days when David wrote songs in caves and cried out to heaven from the edge of despair. And now that same God was looking at him. The weight of that gaze was heavier than any crown ever forged. There is a kind of wilderness that has nothing to do with geography. You can be surrounded by marble columns and cedar panels, by servants and scribes and generals and the constant buzzing noise of a prosperous administration, and still feel the arid, aching silence of a man who does not know if he is enough for the moment has chosen him for. That was the desert Shelomo carried inside his chest in those early days. Not doubt in God, something quieter and in some ways more dangerous, doubt in himself, in whether the weight of an entire generation could be sustained by his shoulders alone, in whether wisdom was something inherited or something that had to be earned in places he had not yet been. He had seen what happened to leaders who confused their position with their purpose, who wore the authority of the crown as though the crown itself carried intelligence, who reached for power before they had ever stopped to reach for God. He had watched some of them unravel slowly, like cloth pulled thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the memory of what they had once been. He did not want to unravel. He wanted to be the kind of king his people deserved, the kind of man that a holy God could trust with a generation. But wanting it was not the same as knowing how to become it. And so he did what the men of his bloodline had always done when the silence grew louder than they could bear alone. He went to meet God, not with a prepared speech, not with the polished religious vocabulary of a man performing faith for an audience. He went the way a son goes to a father when the burden has finally become too honest to carry with dignity, with everything he had and the full knowledge that everything he had was not enough. Gibeon, the high place, the altar still carrying the memory of generations of smoke rising into a sky that seemed to lean closer to earth there than anywhere else, a sky that felt thinner at Gibeon, as though the distance between the human and the divine was not quite as vast as it seemed from the valley floor. Shelomo brought his heart to that altar, not a polished, ceremonial, carefully arranged heart, the real one, the uncertain one, the one that lay awake at night calculating the distances between what was required of him and what he actually possessed. He brought that heart, and with it 1,000 burnt offerings rising before the Lord. Not because the number purchased anything, not because God needed the smoke or the fire or the sacrifice as payment for his attention, but because when a man does not know what words to use, sometimes the most honest thing he can do is show up completely. Bring everything he has to the place where God is known to be, and wait. So he waited. The day gave way to evening. Evening gave way to the deep indigo of a Judean night, the stars appearing one by one in the clear, cold sky above the high place. The fire from the offerings settling into embers that glowed orange in the dark. The priests and attendants had grown quiet. The crowds had gone. It was just a man in the silence and the God who inhabits the silence of surrendered men. And in that night, in that sacred and suspended moment between the end of human striving and the beginning of divine movement, God came. Not in the earthquake, not in the consuming fire that had come to Elijah's altar on Carmel. In the dream. In the deep, unhurried interior place where the noise of the world finally loses its grip, and the voice of heaven can be heard the way it was always meant to be heard. Not as thunder commanding, but as truth arriving. And the presence that came was not neutral. It was not the abstract awareness of something larger than yourself. It was personal. It carried weight. It filled the space of the dream the way the Shekinah once filled the tabernacle, until there was no corner left untouched, no hidden place that had not been reached, no part of Shelomo that was not now standing in the full light of divine attention. And then the words, "Ask, what shall I give you?" 3 words, and they contain everything. The creator of the universe, the God who shaped the mountains from nothing and named every star, and breathed the first breath of life into dust and called it man. The God who parted the sea for a nation of slaves and sent bread from heaven every morning for 40 years, and made the sun stand still at a warrior's request. This God, this infinite, unconstrainable, all-sufficient God, was looking at Shelomo and saying, "Ask anything. What do you want?" This is the moment that separates men. Not the wars they win, not the kingdoms they build, not the speeches they deliver to crowds already prepared to applaud them. The moment that reveals what a man is truly made of is the moment when he can have anything, and what he reaches for tells you everything about where his heart actually lives, about what he actually trusts, about what he believes will ultimately save him. Most men, if they are honest with themselves, know what they would reach for in that moment. Security, the removal of every threat, the guarantee that their enemies could no longer touch them, long life, and wealth. The kind of wealth that does not just solve today's problem but eliminates the category of problems. The kind of wealth that makes the question of survival permanently irrelevant. And these are not shameful desires. They are human desires. The desires of men and women who have lived long enough in a broken world to understand that uncertainty is painful, and that resources create options, and that options feel like safety. But safety is not the same as source, and this is the thing that Shelomo had learned. Not from a teacher, not from a scroll, but from years of watching his father. From watching what happened when David trusted God with the sling and the stone rather than the armor that did not fit. From watching what happened when the man after God's own heart ran into the wilderness and found that even there, especially there, the provision was real. From watching the difference between the days his father stood in his own strength and the days his father stood in God's. He had learned that there is a difference between what you need and what you think you need. That the deepest poverty a leader can carry is not the poverty of resources, but the poverty of wisdom. The inability to hear what heaven is saying in the exact moment when everything on earth is shouting something louder and more urgent and more immediately convincing. He had learned that you can have a full treasury and a bankrupt spirit, that you can command armies and still be governed by fear, that the wealthiest man in the room is not necessarily the one with the most gold. He is the one who knows where the gold actually comes from. And so when Shelomo opened his mouth before God in the night of Gibeon, the words that came were not the words of a man calculating advantage. They were the words of a man who had looked honestly at himself and made peace with what he found. He asked for a hearing heart, a heart that could listen, a heart capable of discerning between good and evil, between the voice of justice and the noise of convenience, between the word of God and the opinion of men. He was standing before the infinite, with a blank invitation in his hands, and what he wrote on it was not a demand. It was a posture. The posture of a man who had decided somewhere in the quiet of his own soul that without God as his source, not his supporter, not his silent partner in an enterprise fundamentally designed around his own plans, but his source, everything else he might accumulate would be, in the end, just sand. And God heard it, not as a clever answer, not as a theological strategy, as the honest prayer of a man who meant every word. And heaven responded the way heaven always responds to that kind of prayer, not just by meeting the request, but by opening. God said, "Because you have asked for this, because you have not asked for long life or for wealth or for the lives of your enemies, because you have asked for understanding, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, such as no one has had before you, and no one will have after you. And then, I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches, honor, the kind of standing among kings that no other man of his generation would know, what you did not ask for." There it is. That is the economy of the kingdom. That is the financial principle that no business school teaches, and no investment strategy can replicate. When a man or a woman positions God as their true source, not in the theoretical sense, not as a Sunday morning affirmation, but in the raw, surrendered, costly reality of a life actually oriented around dependence on God. Heaven does not simply meet the ask. Heaven adds. Heaven opens the categories the person was not even thinking about, and fills them with more than imagination had room to contain. The years that followed Gibeon rewrote what was possible. Shelomo's wisdom spread the way fire spreads when the wind decides to carry it, across borders, across language barriers, across the political hostilities that separated ancient kingdoms from one another. Kings sent delegations, scholars made the journey, merchants carried his sayings along trade routes the way they carried spices and precious cloth, because what he said was worth more than what they were selling. His judgments became the benchmark for justice. His questions became the kind that opened doors and conversations that had been sealed shut for generations. And the wealth. The wealth arrived the way it arrives for men and women who have stopped making it their God and started making it their servant. Not all at once, not from one source, from everywhere. The gold of Ophir arriving in quantities that required new systems of accounting. The cedar of Lebanon carried down from the mountains at the command of a king whose favor Hiram found himself unable to refuse. Fleets returning from distant shores laden with goods that filled storehouses faster than the storehouses could be built. The revenue from trade partnerships that formed not because Shelomo was a brilliant merchant, but because the blessing of God on his enterprises made him the most desirable partner in the ancient world. And then the queen came. She had heard the reports. Every queen of her stature heard the reports. That was part of the function of the intelligence networks that kept powerful rulers informed about shifts in regional influence. But the reports about this king were different. They were not military reports, not territorial expansions or treaty violations. They were reports about wisdom, about a king whose court was a place where hard questions found answers, where the complicated untangled itself, where something was present in the atmosphere of the place that did not have a name in any of the languages her advisors spoke. So she came to see for herself, with camels carrying spices and enormous quantities of gold and precious stones. She came prepared to be impressed by the visible things, the architecture, the treasury, the court protocol, the military display. She came the way powerful people come to see powerful people, with the quiet certainty that she would recognize the magnitude of what she was seeing, because she herself was magnificent. And then she sat in his presence. She asked the hard questions she had been saving. She watched how he moved through them. She saw the table of his household, the attendance of his ministers, the order of his court, the offerings he brought to the house of God. She took it all in, and something left her. Scripture says there was no more spirit in her, that the breath of her own self-sufficiency drained away in the presence of what God had built in and through and around this one surrendered man. She told him that the half had not been told, that the reports, impressive as they were, had failed to capture what was actually here. The half had not been told, because this is what happens when God is the source. He does not meet you halfway. He does not give you enough to get by and then step back and watch you figure out the rest. He builds something so far beyond the ask that the people watching cannot find adequate language for it. But here is what the gold and the cedar and the queen's astonishment cannot fully tell you. Here is what the highlights of the story leave out. The reason all of it worked was not the wisdom. Wisdom was the fruit. The root was a choice made in the night, on a high place, in the silence of a man who could have asked for anything and chose instead to ask for alignment. That is the thing about Shelomo's wealth that you must not miss. It did not come because he was clever about wealth. It came because he was honest about his poverty before God. Because in the one moment that mattered most, he reached not for what would secure him, but for what would connect him to the source of all things. And now the story leans toward you. Because whatever desert you are walking through right now, and if you are watching this, there is something in your life that qualifies as a desert, something arid and uncertain and longer than you expected. That desert is not your ending. That season of silence is not evidence of abandonment. It is your Gibeon, the high place where the question is being asked. What are you reaching for? Not in theory, not in the vocabulary of your faith, but in the actual decisions you are making, the actual sources you are consulting, the actual places you are looking for your security and your provision and your sense of forward motion. What are you reaching for? Because the invitation that came to Shelomo in the night is the same invitation living in your circumstances right now. Ask. And the man or woman who asks for wisdom, for alignment, for a heart that can hear what God is saying in the middle of the noise, that man, that woman, that person will receive wisdom. And then they will receive what they did not ask for. Stop trusting money more than God. Stop building around the provision and neglecting the provider. Stop adding God to your plans like a final approval stamp on a document you have already written. Go to Him first. Make Him your source, not your safety net, not your last resort, not the spiritual dimension of an otherwise self-sufficient strategy. Your source, the origin point, the place where everything begins. And then watch what He adds. Watch the doors open that no opposition can shut. Watch the provision arrive from directions you never calculated. Watch the favor flow into spaces you never tried to enter. Not because you earned it, because this is who He is. This is what He does for men and women who are serious enough about Him to let Him be enough. The desert you are in right now is making you. Let it. And in the silence of it, go to the high place. Bring everything you have, honest and unpolished, and ask for the one thing that makes all the other things possible. He will do the rest. This is a work of Christian inspirational fiction. All images and videos in this production were created using artificial intelligence for the purposes of edification and encouragement.